Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thanks for joining us for this afternoon's event, Civil Discourse on Campus, Controversies, Challenges, and Opportunities. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge with daily activities, examining research questions, projects, conversations in development all across the university. And today we're running this event as a live stream both to YouTube and as well via Zoom. So if you're joining us there, we welcome your comments and your questions. Just plop those into the chat and we'll do our best to read those out a little bit later. And those of you here in the space, similar thing, if you have comments, questions, just raise your hand. We'll run a microphone around so that everyone can hear you. Okay, enough for me. It's very much my pleasure now to pass the microphone over to the Executive Director of the Equity Office here at Concordia, Lisa White. Wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the second installment of the Courageous Conversation series, Civil Discourse on Campus, Controversies, Challenges, and Opportunities. I'd like to first express my appreciation to the colleagues who made this event possible. Of course, our friends at Fourth Space for hosting us and for moderating the Zoom. I also want to thank Fatima Nagavi Oya for her coordination of this event. And of course, I'd like to thank Marc Lafrance, who has developed this series and identified sites for productive and necessary conversation. And finally, thank you all, colleagues in the room, as well as those on Zoom for joining us today. I'll take a moment to collectively set the space for our panelists, for our colleagues, for students, and I think also for ourselves. We together embody such a range of views and perspectives on how to engage with one another on campus and for which purposes. And this reality, of course, offers many rich possibilities as well as opportunities for significant friction and tension. I think we could all agree. So the invitation is this: let's not avoid the friction, but instead approach it with openness, curiosity, and care. And let's also expect and insist to be met with curiosity and care as well throughout this conversation today. I'm sure we can imagine for a variety of reasons why this is a particularly timely discussion to be having today. I know for myself, I am eager to unpack the idea of civil discourse and learn about the ways in which it can be generative, but also silencing, perhaps performative in some moments, why it might be the right approach in certain circumstances, and maybe the wrong approach or the wrong moment to think about civil discourse, and all the shift and nuances in between. We are fortunate that we have our trio of esteemed panelists joining us as we navigate what civil discourse means in a campus and community context, what the potentialities are, what the restrictions are, and maybe the ways in which we could look at this question of civil discourse along a spectrum as opposed to an either-or proposition. I'll first start with introducing Kim Nelson, who is a professor of film and the director of the Humanities Research Group, an institution established at the University of Windsor in 1989 to support and promote the humanities on campus and in the greater community. In her 9 years as director, she has steered the HRG towards in-person interaction and dialogue involving a diversity of topics, speakers, and perspectives, including the initiation of an annual speaker event addressing challenges to civil discourse, recorded and nationally broadcast and internationally streamed with CBC Ideas. Additionally, her films and live documentaries probe questions of identity and belonging and have been screened, performed, and broadcast internationally as well. I also like to introduce Randy Boyagoda, who is a novelist as well as professor of English at the University of Toronto, where he also serves as the university's advisor on civil discourse, the first such position in Canada. He was named one of Toronto's 50 most influential people in Toronto Life magazine because of his work in civil discourse. He is also the author of 7 books, including 4 novels that have been nominated for awards such as the Giller Prize. Additionally, They have been named on lists such as the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice selections and the Globe and Mail Best Books of the Year. And to round out our trio, I'd like to introduce you all as well, for those who may not know him, to Marc Lafrance, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. He served as department chair from 2022 to 2024, and then as interim vice dean for the Faculty of Arts and Science, before being appointed into his current role as special advisor to the provost on campus life. As a sociologist, Marc Lafrance studies the relationship between self, body, and society, representations of gender and sexuality in the media, men's health and well-being, and identity politics in the age of social polarization. He has published extensively in high-impact journals and edited collections, as well as the lead editor of the groundbreaking anthology, The Forgotten Realities of Men, Critical Reflections on Masculinity in Contemporary Society. Additionally, in his current role as special advisor, Lafrance engages in a variety of activities intended to bring Concordia's community members together. He also serves as a conduit of information, consulting community members on campus dynamics and raising awareness around issues of concern. I'll stop there. I want to make sure we have adequate time to really get into what our panelists have to share with us today. And with that, I'd like to invite Kim Nelson to the podium.
All right, thanks so much. It's such an honor to be here. This is such an important conversation following the last conversation, which was wonderful. So warmest thanks to Marc Lafrance for inviting me and to Lisa White. And it's such an honor to share the stage with Randy Boyagoda as well. So the title will become clear through the course of what I have to say to you. And I just want to start by saying that although I understand it, I also find it puzzling and alarming the way some people respond to the idea of civil discourse, that it's partisan or passé or threatening. And I think we're all here because we care about communication, we care about learning, we care about making life and lives better. We're here because we care about the role of universities in creating knowledge and knowledge building practices. And that's what I think we're talking about today. So there's questions we were posed for this afternoon, and I think they're vital, and they really speak to the challenges at universities in engaging civil discourse. So civil discourse is a form, it's not a set of topics, so I'm going to talk about it as a practice and a form. And we really need to disentangle it because there's so many topics that are so important and that we're so justifiably passionate about, but we need to figure out the principles of the practice of how we communicate. So I want to ensure that we're approaching dialogue in a way that enhances learning, that deepens and broadens learning and communication towards better outcomes for the things that we care about. All right, so in the course of this talk, I'm going to make the following points, just for a map for you. So one of my key points is that we pursue principles of civil discourse over narratives. Now, I'm a scholar of historical film and I teach creative writing and screenwriting. I love narratives, and narratives are important, but they do not serve as the foundation for civil discourse. When they do, they corrupt it. So that's one of my key arguments today. Number two, we need to embrace the instability and uncertainties of reality and truth. And C, we have to focus on dialogue that leads to the outcomes that we want to see. We have to focus on what works, and that's where I'm going to end off today. All right, so the questions that were posed to us today are the following. So the first four are going to be the focus of my talk, so I'm not going to go into them right now, but I want to talk about the last three before I get started. Okay, is the idea of civility itself shaped by the dynamics of power and privilege? So I'm going to say no. If it's done properly, it's not. So when civility is being approached with power and privilege, and I think that's what leads to a lot of people's discomfort with it, and I will talk about that, that's when it's not being done correctly. And the power of civil discourse is when that is not a part of it. So it's really important to do it right. The power and privilege, we work to mitigate that. And I'm hoping that the principles that I propose, and I welcome other proposals, would work towards that. Number 6, Can discourse remain civil when some groups have more at stake than others? To this, I say yes, it has to. I think one thing that's important is that we want people with less at stake to be part of the dialogue. Do we want them to do most of the talking? No. But we do want them to listen, but we also want them to contribute because we want people with less at stake to join and to care about something that they do have less at stake in. So I think it's really important that we really widen and include people with less at stake. Okay, do all questions deserve a civil response, particularly when they're framed in ways that some consider hateful? So to this, I say yes as well, for two reasons. Sometimes we think people are being hateful and they're not. I think I've been guilty of that, and we misinterpret, or people put things together in a way that's not the best formed, or it's open to misinterpretation. And then some people are truly hateful. We know that. Either way, you do not want to respond in kind. So one thing that I think about is this quote from Marcus Aurelius. So he wrote these personal journals that are quite famous, the Meditations. And in book 6, part 6, he wrote, "The best revenge is to not be like that." So, which means the best revenge is when someone's attacking you or treating you badly, you just cannot let them bring you to their level. So I think this is how we can think about how we want to deal with people that try to goad us, the bullies and the blowhards. The worst thing we can do is let them make us behave the way they're behaving. All right, so I'm going to return to questions 1 to 4. So I won't necessarily address them in order, but these are going to frame the rest of my talk. So we have to remember civil discourse is about speaking. It's about the exchange of ideas. And it's how we build shared visions for organizing and taking action. But we need to take that first step of dialogue before we take those other steps. And now I share the stage with national leaders in civil discourse at their respective universities. And these turn out to be really courageous positions because I think I understand there's so many issues and there's so much harm being created. I think when people are not engaging in civil discourse, or just because of these high stakes of some of the issues that people are dealing with. But it's really important that we not see civil discourse as the problem. Because again, I think if it's being done right, it's really key to the solution. And that people representing civil discourse, because I've witnessed people kind of attacking the people in these positions. And that I find, curious, and it's showing how far we have to go to try to get dialogue on track. So I think what civil discourse has is a branding problem. I think when we think of civil discourse, we might think of images like this. So you've got something that looks very hierarchical. You have a group that excludes a lot of different kinds of people. Civility can be associated with politeness, and politeness can be associated with being passive-aggressive or shallow or following traditions that only some people know how to follow. So it can exclude. And that is not what we're talking about. Civil discourse means something else, and so this is not the civil discourse that we're aiming for. What it is, it's a practice of respectful, open, and constructive conversation about public issues, focusing on understanding opposing viewpoints rather than winning arguments. So I think if we called civil discourse open discourse or effective discourse, people might not have the same kind of reactions to it, and there might be less confusion about it. Okay, a new question I wanted to add is why. So I think the goal of civil discourse is to work together. We need to perceive reality to seek truth. And truth is the ultimate in the journey, not the goal pursuits. So whenever it comes to a complex truth, whether that be in the sciences or in the humanities, you search for truth even though you might never get there, or it might always be shifting. There might be always another way to see it, but this is like one of the most important things we can do as humans and at the university. So things are very perilous right now. We've got a lot of threats in our world, and we all know how algorithms, online content, and apps are affecting the nature of communication. But our success as a species has always relied on our ability to communicate and cooperate. So this book The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone, is a good example. In the book, Sloman and Fernbach, who are cognitive neuroscientists, explain that we all have these fallacies that we understand a lot more on our own than we actually do, and that we rely so much on histories of knowledge and communities of knowledge. So early in the book, they give an example of if you ask somebody if they know how a toilet works, they'll say yes. And then if you next say, okay, explain it, then they kind of realize, they pull on the handle, that's not explaining how it works, and people don't really know. And they give the example of an airplane, like the thousands of people that go into designing, creating, building, maintaining, putting together, flying it, organizing it. There's thousands of people with knowledge that they don't know how to do the other person's job, but they all work together to do it. And so when we sit on an airplane, we've relied on all these people. And yet some of the social issues that we're dealing with are far more complicated than flying in an airplane. And I think this idea of how much we need each other, really, I just want to give a brief shout out. I don't want to talk, but Randy Boyagoda has this concept that means a lot to me. It's called thinking out loud together. And it kind of makes me think about that, how much we need each other. And if we think about it, it's such a great model, because if you think about how you think yourself, you have ideas in your head, and we have a lot of ideas that will come through our head, and we'll engage thought experiments, we'll think kind of crazy things, and then hopefully we don't then start attacking ourselves. Like, that was such a stupid thing to think, how could you? Because you would shut down your ability to think. So I think for me, it speaks to me as a great way to think about the same way we kind of work things out in our head, we need to do that together with groups of people. So I think the university plays a key role in modeling and practicing civil discourse, because if it's not happening at universities, where is it going to happen? And I think we're not doing a great job of it from within, and we're facing a lot of threats from without. And we also have to remember that universities are post-secondary institutions, and we want to think about what we want this dialogue to look like. We need to graduate from high school, and I'm going to briefly take you back to mine. So this image, I was hoping that I was in grade school when this song came out, but it turns out it actually came out this September that I entered junior high school. So this is a very generation-specific reference, but I will tell you, if you go on YouTube and look up reaction videos, there's delightful Gen Z reaction videos to this song. And to me, it's a metaphor of the experience of junior high school. And I think it should be given out, this song should be given out to students when they're assigned their locker. So why is it a jungle? For me, it's because of bullying, and I'm sure everyone's been bullied at some point or another. When I was in grade 8, and especially even more so in grade 9, I was really brutally bullied by a group of girls in the grade older than me. And when it was happening, my mom said to me, don't worry, it'll get better. After high school, everything will be better and you'll show them. Well, first of all, I wasn't really interested in showing them. I just kind of wanted it to stop. And secondly, it made me believe that this kind of behavior was like a teenager thing, and then it would just immediately stop because adults are so professional, rational, and organized, and they run the world and everything's safe. And so it was really, upsetting to find out that was not true at all. And the way I responded to this advice, which was coming from a good place from her, but I tried to hide and I tried to disappear and I tried to wait it out. But there isn't waiting out bullying, because it's unfortunately a very human mode of behavior. It's an exercise of power that's exercised through cruelty and humiliation. And, this law of the jungle that is active in high school is active in the adult world as well. I think sometimes the bullying can be sometimes more covert, a little more underground. People's hormones are generally more settled, but it's just a way that humans interact. It's a raw and pure human environment. So although we leave the building, we never totally leave the social dynamics of high school. So I think we need to think about how we elevate the thoughtfulness we're capable of that's exhibited in high school as well. How do we disincentivize bullying? We have to dispense with shunning, shaming, social exclusion, and name calling, because the power of this threat, I think, is very active throughout academia, sadly. We can let that be what the bullies do, and we should never let them drag us to their level. And I see bullying tactics in mainstream behaviors of intellectual speech that shame and name call, and even those that silence nuance and dissent with the threat of social exclusion, which for all of human history has meant social death. And worse, I'm going to have a reference in the next slide to somebody whose social exclusion did lead to his death. Okay, so finally, the principles of civil discourse. So the biggest, most important principle of civil discourse is epistemic humility. So epistemic meaning knowledge, and humility meaning being humble about one's own knowledge. The thing is, we're all naturally very humble about other people's knowledge, especially if we don't agree with them. So skepticism is innate. If it's somebody else's point of view, our brain works really hard to reassure us like all the reasons it's wrong and all the reasons we're right. So it takes a real intelligence to be able to use metacognition to sort of step back from your own thinking. I think Buddhism is wonderful for this, to be able to sort of separate yourself from your own thoughts and your own beliefs and to have skepticism towards your own ideas. I think you can hold those ideas strongly, but sort of flexibly, like with a willingness to always to learn more. So this is the foundation of civil discourse. And it's the mark of true intelligence going back to a lot of religions and philosophies, including maybe the most famous reference in Plato's Apology of Socrates, when Socrates has to begrudgingly admit that he is, as the oracle at Delphi said in 440 BCE, the smartest living man. He first objects to this. He couldn't be the smartest. And then as he goes through the other men that he thinks are smarter than him, he realizes that they all think they're so smart, and therefore they're not very smart at all. So he says this about this other person he thinks might be smarter. He thinks he knows something when he doesn't, whereas just as I don't know anything, so I don't think I do either. So it's this, I am so smart because I know I don't know anything, is basically what Socrates is saying. So I think another way to understand epistemic humility is to think about what happens when it's not there. If you don't have epistemic humility, when you talk, it's kind of an exercise in self-actualization. It can be a performance of self-righteousness, and it's effective towards the following goals: to signal your ideological commitments, to curtail the speech of others, and worst of all, what you don't want is to embolden opposing extremes. So without epistemic humility, we project narratives through power. And that's the way of the bully. And sometimes these narratives are right or righteous, but it's just not the correct way to put them forward. And you're not even going to be able to maybe get through to people you maybe could if you try to reach them through the principles of civil discourse. You enter instead into a battle of narratives. And I challenge any of you to tell me about an epistemologically humble bully. All right, so the rest of the principles, which are all sort of sub to epistemic humility, but all very important, include curiosity, which includes deep listening. I think this is really hard, but it's something that it's a really good thing to do, to listen deeply, to really understand where people are coming from, to interpret people in good faith. Plurality, this includes flexibility and openness and avoiding binary thinking, compassion for others, and compassion for yourself. I have this theory that I think a lot of times when people are really hard on other people, that they're probably really hard on themselves as well. So to be compassionate for everyone, including yourself, to be evidence-based. So the important thing, and we have to understand, is the recourse to evidence is crucial, but if it's by itself, if it's untethered from these other principles, you don't convince anyone. People will cling to their evidence and you won't get anywhere. So we want to be committed to truth-seeking, to being reality-focused, and a recourse to data. And this is important with these other principles. And then reciprocity, which is the golden rule of speaking to other people the way you want to be spoken to, and especially keeping in mind, how do you want people who disagree with you to engage with what you have to say, and to treat them that way as well. So I do want to talk now a little bit about narratives and why they don't work to be the foundation for civil discourse. So narratives are contingent and they exclude. That's how a narrative works. Now, narratives are how we make sense of the world. It's what you do when you sit down and talk to a hairdresser or a friend. It's how you make sense of your past. We do it on a personal level. We do it collectively through history. And it's a way to kind of make sense of what happened so we know what to do in the present and hopefully to avoid pain and suffering in the future. So they're very, very important, but they always exclude. So you're including certain elements, you're putting them in a structure, and you're creating a causal links to create meaning. And that's what we do with a narrative. And I can tell you from studying narrative as a scholar and from teaching it as a film professor, narratives always have to have conflict. If you try to have a narrative without a conflict, you have a braggy Instagram story. You have someone's incredibly boring slideshow of their amazing trip to Mexico. You have the really boring uncle's form letter at the holidays about how wonderful everyone in his family is doing. And I don't think it's that we want people to be having a bad holiday, but we do learn from conflict. And so conflicts are embedded in narratives. So you can see that if you had a narrative for these things, if you were curious only about certain things, if you extend plurality to only mean certain people, that you're excluding, and then other people are excluding you, and then we're not really getting anywhere. So we have to base coming together on these universals. All right. So I'm going to end off by talking about what to do and what not to do. So I think we want to look at the behaviors of people whose ideas scare us the most. How do they spread their ideas? We always want to see what's effective, but we also want to be really sure that we're not behaving in ways that we don't want to emulate. We need to be less gatekeepy, I think, on campus, less fearful and less judgmental. We can't assume that the person in front of us is the worst troll from the internet. I think when someone expresses X, and again, I want to stay out of topics, but if someone expresses X and we don't agree with X, I think what we naturally will do is we'll think, well, if I thought X, I would also have to think Y and Z, and you come up with this whole narrative of all the things they believe and how that's so terrible that they would believe those things. But if you haven't engaged the principles of civil discourse, you don't really know how they came to that, and you've shut down the ability to learn and maybe to exchange and maybe have them change their minds. So, and I think if we all think back to how we respond when people react badly to our ideas and shame us and make us feel bad, it doesn't make us see the error of our ways. It often makes us shut down, feel defensive, and seek out people who will agree with us. So we need to cultivate openness as a muscle. It's not necessarily natural. Our brain protects us by, reinforcing our own ideas. And it's rational to be afraid of openness, that it might encourage noxious and hateful ideas. But openness is not credulity. I don't think we have to fear that we're going to get brainwashed by someone's bad ideas. And also by shutting down bad ideas, we know so many examples of people whose bad ideas, they've tried to shut them down only to see them grow stronger. So without a robust and open civil discourse on campus, bullies, no matter how some of them might have right ideas, but they patrol the halls and they monitor our thoughts, our language, our content and form. They enforce behaviors through fear, particularly the fear of social banishment. If you have opinions that vary from the orthodoxy, if you use the wrong words, if you're working out your thoughts and say something in an unformed way, you may be attacked and ejected from civil society. To avoid this, you have to keep to a very narrow path of accepted thought, and to be really sure, you need to stay well within those boundaries. You keep your head down, don't make eye contact. These are the laws of bullying. We cannot be cowed and controlled by people who consciously or unconsciously misinterpret us in bad faith with the threat of calling us names that mean social death. And we can only stop it if we extend grace and speak openly to each other. Civil discourse as a mode of thinking and interacting must be taught to be practiced, and I think it should be taught in elementary school and all the way through to universities. It requires a letting go of fear, of clinging to cliques, and it requires tempering of our judgment and more emphasis on calling in, and this is the concept I want to end on. So calling in was coined by a teenager, Marc Lafrance, and they came up with the term in response to their experience at the Facing Race Conference on Racial Justice in Baltimore, Maryland in 2012, and they wrote a blog post about it. And Tran was really upset because they're all there to work together, and then all these fights broke out and people were calling each other out. So they came up with this term, calling in, and this calling in term has been beautifully developed by Loretta Ross. So Loretta Ross's book just came out last week, and I was lucky enough to get a copy right away. There's a lot of videos online that I would recommend you check out. So she has worked in human rights and social justice for decades, since going back to the 70s. Her work is incredible, and her ability to work with people who have done terrible things is absolutely incredible. And this is my point too, she urges calling in over calling out and power with over power over, not because it's better or these other kinds of things, but because it works, it's more effective. And some people will not answer this call to be called in, and in their responses, they'll reveal themselves. But we don't have to, and we don't want to be like that. Being this way, being open in this way, requires strength and character. In many ways, the principles of civility do involve power. They will require the most impressive power of all, the power to regulate our emotions, our fragility, and our fear. My hope is that universities can lead in this mission of constructive dialogue at a time when we so desperately need it. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here at Concordia in this fourth space for this session. I will confess, Kim, that you're mentioning the importance of conversation with hairdressers and friends left me excluded based on lived experience. Twice. But that said, I'd like to begin my remarks by just drawing attention perhaps to three keynotes that I'd like to, or keywords maybe, phrases that I'd like to put in play, and then I'll say a little bit more about how I think about civil discourse. I was glad that Lisa mentioned friction, because one of the writers who I think is very persuasive on this point is Eula Bliss. She has a book entitled Having and Being Had, in which she talks about one of the great challenges of contemporary life, especially for people living securely. And I'll include most of us, all of us probably in this room in that category if you're sitting at a university listening to a talk that's being podcasted. That we have come to this expectation of frictionless living. That when it comes to our experience negotiating technology, negotiating social relations, we have this expectation of a frictionless baseline. And then when we encounter friction, we don't know what to do with it. So just think about friction versus our expectations of frictionless living. Just as an easy example of it, think about the speed with which you get frustrated when an app isn't working, or you tap and it doesn't work. For people like us, this is terrifying that this isn't working. Frictionless living was something we've come to expect. Second, is the importance of shared terms. I'm reading a biography right now of Malcolm Cowley. He was a very influential writer and literary editor in the United States through mid-century. And in the early 1930s, for the magazine The New Republic, he wrote up a report on a really violent company reaction to striking coal miners in rural Kentucky in the early 1930s. And then he tried to make sense of what was happening, and he was amazed at the company's account of what was happening versus the striking miners' account. And so then in the New Republic, he posed the following question, or something along these lines. I'm paraphrasing. How do you have a conversation with someone when what you call black, they call white, and what you call white, they call black? In other words, when you're looking at the same thing and seeing fundamentally different things, how can you have a conversation if you don't have shared terms? And then third and finally, and this will perhaps be my transition into the main part of my remarks, in the 1990s, mid-1990s, in a criticism of neoliberalism and its presumption to just solve everything with efficiency and markets, Harvard professor Michael Sandel wrote a book called Democracy's Discontent, in which he worried about, quote, the civic consequences of economic power. If everything is just being solved with markets, What does that do to our shared life, our investment in a shared civic life? And his main criticism of the neoliberal arrangements was that they were disempowering. If everything is just happening through these systems, the market just takes care of these things, it disempowers you from joining a shared public life. I worry sometimes that this is a problem, to modify the term for a moment from Sandel, in the university. In other words, my last couple of years as the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse has perhaps given me a sense, not specific to U of T, but certainly not at U of T, about the civic consequences of administrative or procedural power. That this is one of the great challenges I think we have in sustaining productive disagreement, dialogue across difference in situations where we lack shared terms, where we expect frictionless encounters, and where we can feel disempowered, I think. So, to go from there, let me say a little bit about the origin story for the Civil Discourse Project at U of T, how I became involved with it, and then what I've noticed over the last couple of years in this role. I was appointed the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse in January of 2024. It is undeniable that this appointment followed upon the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent and ongoing military campaign in Gaza and elsewhere. Undeniable. That said, and as I've said in many contexts, it's not like civil discourse at U of T was amazing on October 6th, and then suddenly something changed. The fact of the matter is, the campus protests that happened at U of T and elsewhere, including I know here at Concordia, after October 7th, were the most dramatic manifestation of a long-standing challenge, which is that professors and students with each other, faculty with each other, staff trying to manage all of this and contribute, have had a hard time thinking out loud together. As Kim suggested, that is my working term for civil discourse. What is civil discourse? It is a commitment to thinking out loud together. It is recognizing difference, reckoning with it, and being open to the possibility that engaging with someone who disagrees with you can lead to an increased understanding of an idea or an issue that matters, or at the very least, a better appreciation of someone else's perspective on an idea or an issue that matters. And ultimately, if practiced, as Kim was saying, civil discourse can aid in the advance of knowledge, serve the common good, and help with the pursuit of truth. And if we can't do this at a university, it strikes me that we are failing in our public responsibility as institutions of higher education. Now, that all sounds fine in theory, but it's the reality that's hard. And one thing that I have certainly noticed in my couple of years in this work is first a credibility question. Why am I doing this? Is it because I'm a CBC-friendly model minority who gets along with people? Yeah, probably to some degree that's true. But why else am I doing this? Well, I'm a university administrator, so I have a sense of how the university itself works. I'm a novelist who was the president of PEN Canada, the Freedom of Expression organization. And I think this is perhaps the key point, I have an academic interest in this. One of the writers I work on is Salman Rushdie, and in particular, The Satanic Verses, his 1988 novel, which of course led to a fatwa being pronounced upon by the Ayatollah Khomeini on February 14th, 1989. My interest is in what I describe as the public life of books. How can we have a novel that is simultaneously a source of edification and entertainment and a source of such offense that people commit acts of violence because of its very existence? How can we have a shared public life in which people can read this novel and also be offended? That's what I call the public life of a book. So I have an academic interest in this. I mention that because, again, it seems to me that if we can't point to some rationale for our interests beyond our institutional identities or our lived experience, if there isn't a kind of an academic context for why you're joining, it seems to me hard to take people seriously. So I took on this job, and I was asked to work with colleagues, staff, faculty, and students from across U of T to establish the state of civil discourse at the University of Toronto, the stakes for it, what we were doing well and what we were not doing well. The Civil Discourse Working Group itself was made up of about 15 faculty and students from across our 3 campuses. Politically, demographically, in terms of disciplines, a great diversity. And we spent the first 6 months meeting once a month for lunch for 2 hours to agree to a definition of civil discourse, and we failed. This will surprise no one who's at a university, especially any faculty member or staff member who's been on a committee. But here's the key. We kept talking. We kept thinking out loud together. My proposal to these colleagues who are members of this working group was that if we can't think out loud together once a month over lunch, how can we expect this of 100,000 people across 3 campuses in a 4 million person city? It's not plausible. We need to be able to model this ourselves, because I think one of the key features of civil discourse itself, you can't learn it in a webinar. Hi, I'm Randy. I'm here to tell you the 3 key things. It doesn't work. You have to practice it. It is the practicing of it that leads to learning what it actually involves. Every week over the last 2 years, I have been invited to give a talk on civil discourse somewhere across this country and in the United States and overseas, which tells us what? Take consolation that you are not alone if you have problems with civil discourse at Concordia. We should take consolation that we are not alone in having civil discourse issues in the university world. There are problems with this everywhere. But what I thought I would do, to the degree that it would be helpful, is give you a sense of the recurring features that I have noticed across the board in terms of people pointing to challenges with civil discourse, whether it's an accountant group in Alberta, I kid you not, or a parent-teacher organization in Scarborough. Same patterns over and over again. So here's the main things that I've noticed. First, we are living through a profound crisis of trust. We live in what social scientists call a low trust environment. Students don't trust professors. Professors don't trust students. They don't trust each other. The administration doesn't trust the faculty, staff, and students, and vice versa. So that if you want to think out loud about something, you don't trust that if you get it wrong, you're not going to be supported in this. You're not going to be drawn further into a conversation. The calling in suggestion that Kim had. We live with in a profound crisis of trust. It goes further though. We don't trust ourselves. We live in a fear-based response to difficult conversations. I'm scared to find out what Marc really thinks about this issue. I'm scared for him to find out what I think. And I'm kind of scared to figure out what I think, but I can only figure it out by saying it. So I'm not even gonna bother saying it. Why? Because I don't have, and this is very important, a complete view about vaccines. I don't. But if I start speaking, I don't know what you're going to say. I don't even know what I'm gonna say. And I don't trust myself or him. So we live in a low trust environment. Second, power is everywhere. Now we know this by way of Michel Foucault, the French theorist. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. I certainly am as an English professor. But with apologies, I don't think Foucault is exactly right in suggesting that power is everywhere. In my experience with civil discourse challenges, power is elsewhere. We all have a sense that power is somewhere else. Someone else is making these decisions. Some other body has this control. I don't have power, say the students. The professor does, because the professor assigns grades and gives out rec letters. I don't have power, says the professor. The chair does, the dean does, the students do with their phones. I don't have power, says the president. It's the board. It's the Globe and Mail editorial page. We all seem to think power is elsewhere. And this is a large part, to go back to Sandel, of why we feel disempowered. But I also think we're not being honest with ourselves. We're not willing to reckon with the power we do have, each of us. Because to do that is to accept that there's friction. It's easier to say all the power is here and I have none, rather than to say I have a ratio of power, you have a ratio of power, and we're contesting with each other now. It goes back to the storytelling and the conflict idea. So power and trust. Third, and I think self-evidently, the atomizing effects of technology. It's amazing that we're able to do this right now in this room and then likewise online. But I think it's fair to say that in retrospect, and I say this as someone who was involved, telling a whole cohort of young people, the best thing you can do for public health is sit in a room all day long staring at a screen. And I say this as someone responsible for academic continuity at U of T during the pandemic for the Faculty of Arts and Science and its undergraduate division. I think it's had atomizing effects. Why? Because if I don't like what you're saying, I can just turn off the screen. I can just click leave. But now I'm sitting beside you in a classroom. You are embodying difference and disagreement. Friction, again. How am I going to deal with this? I think it's also true for staff, and it's also true for graduate students who became faculty during the pandemic. That kind of core transition period was done virtually. It was done with very little friction. And now we're together, we're in person. How do we deal with that? So technology, and let me add, at the same time, let's not hide this. I think universities were too enthusiastic adopters of technology, both for efficiency and then I think out of a kind of generational perception that this was cool to use technology over and over again. Hey, use your smartphone to tell the world what you to tell the world about your research. Talk about everything using your smartphone. October 7th happens. Shut up. Don't say anything anymore. Think about that for a moment. The signals that universities were giving faculty about disseminating their research in creative new ways using technology. And then it stops immediately. And we don't even talk about why. But I think what it comes down to is a too idealistic adoption of technology on the part of administrations of institutions, and then these atomizing effects that it has had, I think, on not just students, but on people who are transitioning in their careers, joining the professoriate or going to graduate school in virtual ways, in frictionless ways. Related to that would be, I think, generational differences in our expectations of the relationship between your personal belief system, your professional life, and your public, and your institution's commitments. I'll give you two very straightforward examples. One would be, and this is something that I've noticed again and again in these talks across Canada, public libraries, and the tensions between public libraries being spaces of freedom and spaces of inclusion, when these two things have friction with each other, and then the fact that often people are drawn to libraries because they're drawn to the mission of a library. And that mission often includes a kind of recognition of their lived experience and their identities, which they will then often display with buttons. And then you'll have a patron complain about a button, and then the junior staffer is very confused. Hang on a second, why am I allowed to wear these buttons but not this one? I can wear Ukraine but not Palestine. Why is that? And then there's not even an ability to have a conversation about that. But what is revealed is a one-to-one expectation between my political beliefs as a person and what my professional life involves, and then what the institution affirms on my behalf. Again, frictionless. I expect one-to-one instead of pluralism or conflict. Again, I've noticed this in generational terms. It's also true for people who go into, let's say, the public service. They go into the public service under one government, and then government changes, and they still need to provide rigorous and thoughtful analysis of a question, but they don't agree with this government. So they offer the pros of one thing and the cons of another, instead of doing this as civil servants should. This is, again, a generation-specific thing that I'm noticing. The final thing I want to note And then I'll say a little bit about solutions, and I think we're going to hear from Marc. Affirming Kim's point about epistemic humility, which comes from Michael Spence, legal scholar at University College London. His version of what Concordia is doing, what we're doing at U of T, his is called disagreeing well. The same model as what we're doing here in many ways. But it seems to me that the most important idea is that you need to determine and sustain local solutions to these problems. I don't think universities in Alberta adopting the University of Chicago's principles on institutional neutrality is going to work. Why? Because the Calvin report from 1967 that suggested that the university should not be a critic, should not have a thumb on the scale in a rancorous question, but create the conditions for multiple critics to come forward. That's the strongest version of institutional neutrality that I'm aware of. That has been, for those of you that don't know, that has been something the Alberta government has expected Alberta's universities to adopt. It won't make sense. Why? Because what happened at Chicago with that statement comes out of decades at Chicago of a certain kind of institutional culture. It wouldn't make sense to just apply it elsewhere. We can learn from other places. We should. That's the idea of circulating ideas and people. It's something the universities are very good at. But the solution has to make sense at Concordia, with who and what Concordia is, and its own history, its own geography, its own demographics. And it seems to me like that is a very important thing to keep in mind, rather than just saying, why can't we be like this place that does it that way? Because you're not that place. You're not doing it that way. You're not doing anything else that they do that way. So local solutions seem to me to make a great deal of sense. Finally, and this is where I will close, I just want to say a little bit about the importance of modeling this for others. Again, kind of speaking a little bit to what Kim was suggesting. I met at a literary event in Toronto a little while ago, and I'm going to be careful here, and you'll see why. I met a journalist from Afghanistan who keeps alive and broadcasting the only Afghan television station still in operation since the Taliban took over the country again. And he talks to the Taliban. He interviews the Taliban. The Taliban at times will disseminate information through his network. The Taliban also want to kill him. So whenever we think we have high stakes in a difficult conversation, just keep that model in mind. His work as a journalist, his commitment to Afghanistan, means he's willing to talk to people who officially want to kill him. And yet, and he certainly suggested this to me, the Taliban isn't a monolith. Inside the Taliban, there are people who want to kill him, there are people who want to talk to him. There are people who realize there's been a flood and we got to get some information out, and you've got a way to do so. And so a willingness to speak to people who absolutely see differently than you and accepting the inevitable friction there, but coming to shared terms. We can at least all agree this earthquake is a problem and people should know more about it. Yes? Yes. Okay, then we can keep on going, and then maybe we can build on something like that to think out loud together about other things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim and Randy. I want to express my gratitude, first and foremost, to our speakers today for their very thoughtful reflections on civil discourse on university campuses today. I'm grateful not only for the substance of what they've shared, but also for the spirit in which they've shared it, with humor, with seriousness, and with a clear-eyed sense of what is at stake. My remarks today will seek to synthesize much of what they've said, while also bringing it all home, that is to say, to the life of our campus and its members. Now, as we all know all too well, we live in a time of deepening political polarization and mounting social tension. Democratic structures are weakening as strongman leaders rise to prominence around the world, ushering in a new era of aggrieved entitlement, radical populism, ideological extremism, and encroaching authoritarianism. More than any other, this era has shaped and been shaped by the media. Every day we navigate a kaleidoscopic landscape of new media forms in which misinformation spreads rapidly and in which contempt often travels faster than careful analysis and informed critique. Similarly, we have witnessed the spectacular rise of online influencers who monetize anger and resentment, often eclipsing news sources that operate according to editorial standards and once agreed upon forms of public accountability. Of course, all of this is playing out in what many have described as a post-fact age, in which what counts as objectively true and empirically verifiable is itself increasingly contested. Old consensuses have been replaced by a new normal that sees opposing groups arguing ad nauseum over what counts as real or fake. As longtime CBC reporter Carol Off puts it in her recent book, we are quite literally at a loss for words in this age of rage. Universities, of course, do not operate outside the age of rage. In fact, they often find themselves very much in its crosshairs. As has been widely reported, public faith in universities has declined appreciably over recent years. They are seen by some as increasingly censorious and repressive, and are viewed by others as places where so-called woke politics are at their most excessive. It is perhaps unsurprising then that as public faith in universities has declined, so too has the entire notion of expertise, scientific or otherwise, creating a context in which universities are no longer widely regarded as authoritative, or in some cases even credible, sites of knowledge production. Like institutions of higher learning around the world, Concordia has met with challenges in relation to civil discourse, or what we might call dialogue across difference. While the catastrophic events associated with the Israel-Palestine conflict have been at the center of these challenges, they've not been the only ones weighing on our community members. Others have also affected the lives of our members, including Russia's war on Ukraine, mass atrocities in China and Sudan, regime-sponsored massacres in Iran, and brutal crackdowns on immigration in the United States. These are but a few examples of the catastrophic events that our community members carry with them every day and which shape their experiences of campus life. And if there's one thing that has become clear to me, it is that our members experience these events as urgently as they do precisely because they are at our institution to learn how to make sense of them. Through teaching and learning, research and the pursuit of knowledge, activism and movement politics, our members do the hard work of trying to understand the world around them, analyzing its structures and often criticizing its functions. Indeed, the problems of the day are not ones from which our community members can separate themselves, because these problems are exactly the ones they're being asked to confront, morally, ethically, and above all, intellectually. In other words, the political is personal on university campuses in ways it may not be elsewhere. As special advisor to the Provo on campus life, I've had the honor and the privilege of meeting with over 250 community members, including students, staff, faculty, and administrators in confidential listening sessions. The sessions lasted up to 2 hours and were held between October 2024 and August 2025. Community members were invited to bring their entire persons with them to these sessions. That is, not only their academic analyses and critiques of campus life, but also their emotional experiences of it, their pain, their suffering, and their struggles. It became clear to me that the intellectual and the emotional were equally important here. and that both needed to be actively engaged. During the listening sessions, I heard hundreds of personal accounts of campus life. They allowed me to understand, however incompletely and imperfectly, the high stakes bound up with civil discourse at a university like ours, because it was precisely due to the fact that civil discourse has deteriorated on our campus that so many of these people were in my office, talking to me about the things they didn't feel they could talk about elsewhere. Now, let's be clear. It would be a mistake to suggest that civil discourse has become impossible on our campus. My listening sessions suggest that there are successes every day, even if they rarely attract attention or make their way into salacious headlines. The successes can be seen in teaching and learning when students engage with ideas that challenge their assumptions, complicate their deeply held beliefs, and in some cases, even make them change their minds. They appear in classroom discussions as well, in moments of genuine understanding on issues that might otherwise alienate and estrange those on opposite sides. And they play out beyond the classroom too. Many of the students I met with told me about transformative conversations they have had with people they thought they disagreed with, whether in a cafe, at a social event, or even at a campus protest. Everyday successes can also be seen when professors teach books and articles with which they disagree, sometimes deeply disagree, but push themselves to do so anyway, in the most balanced way possible. Indeed, I met with many faculty members who have actively sought out additional pedagogical training to ensure that their students receive the most even-handed learning experiences possible. These are forms of civil discourse in action, moments in which disagreement becomes an occasion for inquiry rather than enmity. What these everyday successes share is not necessarily that they lead to agreement or consensus. Many of them may even feel unsatisfying because problems remain unresolved, and not even agreeing to disagree always feels entirely possible. But what they share above all is something more fundamental. They are acts of intellectual humanization. They interrupt a tendency that animates all of us, whether we like to admit it or not, the tendency to reduce those with whom we disagree to objects. Civil discourse at its best is the work of resisting this reduction and preserving the conditions of human recognition in academic life. Preserving these conditions is more than a consolation prize. It is the prize, and one of the most urgent forms of work we must undertake on university campuses. Now, recognizing our successes is crucial, but we must also consider the price we pay when civil discourse falters. My listening session suggests that one price we pay is withdrawal. People retreat into familiar circles and patterns, avoiding difficult conversations, not out of indifference, but out of anxiety and fear. Closely connected to withdrawal is loneliness, or in this case, what I might even call aloneness. As tensions rise, people sometimes fall out with friends and colleagues. I heard a lot of stories like that. Friends and colleagues they've known for years or feel excluded from communities that they were once a part of. And linked to loneliness, of course, is silence and self-censorship. Many on our campus do not feel that they can ask questions or fully express themselves because they are worried about getting it wrong or of being publicly shamed, both in person and online. This is something we are seeing on campuses across Canada and the world. When civil discourse falters, political positions harden, often leading to rigid orthodoxies. Community members have described to me how the rigidity of these orthodoxies can lead to a kind of ideological disorientation. One member aptly described it as a feeling of political statelessness, no longer feeling fully at home in familiar alignments, but not knowing where else to go. In an age of what many now call polycrisis, This feeling has become increasingly common, and it's inseparable from the exhaustion that cuts across so many communities on campus where civil discourse is concerned. Perhaps the highest price we pay when civil discourse falters is despair. The feeling that hard conversations have become impossible, that genuine exchange is no longer possible, that we don't even want to try anymore, and that all paths forward lead backward. I have felt that despair begin to set in here at Concordia, and it must be dealt with head on. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. So the central claim I wish to make today is a simple one. The work of civil discourse is not optional in today's universities. It is fundamental. And at a time when they are under siege, universities will neither survive nor thrive without it. Civil discourse in an age of rage will be hard, uncomfortable, and often unsatisfying. I'm really selling it, I know. But in an institution where our central mission is to foster what we might call intellectual citizenship, civil discourse is the practice through which this citizenship becomes possible. The deterioration of civil discourse it's not only a challenge, it's also an opportunity. An opportunity for universities to re-establish their relevance as dialogue leaders and to bring that leadership to society at large where there is an undeniable need for it. Indeed, the universities that will be the most relevant now and in the future will be those that can model civil discourse, both on and off campus. Those that can foster spaces where disagreement does not automatically become antagonism, and where intellectual citizenship remains a living practice rather than an abstract ideal. Today's event, this gathering, this conversation, this collective act of reflection, is an example of us doing this kind of citizenship. We won't solve all, or maybe even any, of the problems of the world today. We'll continue to wrestle. But perhaps if we can renew our commitment to the humanizing project of civil discourse, we will learn to wrestle better. Thanks.
I think I speak for the room when I express my deep appreciation and our deep appreciation for these reflections. And I think, if I'm not being overly hopeful, possible ways forward. So thank you to our panelists. It's the time to exchange, colleagues, friends, guests in the space. I'd like to open up the floor for questions, answers, and it's mutual. So we don't all hold the answers, and we certainly don't all hold the questions. Our colleagues in the fourth space are going to circulate with the mic, as well as invite those who are attending via Zoom to also engage with our panelists and some of the ideas that were put forward. So please.
For those of you in the space, yes, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring you this microphone. I already see 2, 3, amazing. Again, a reminder for those of you on Zoom, if you have a question, pop it into the chat and we'll do our best to get it to these panelists. But over to, I believe, Liz.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for all of these insights to each of the panelists. And I wanted to ask you a question about the limits of listening.
We had an event at the University of Toronto Mississauga last year with Judge Marion Buller. Some of you, actually many of you know that Judge Buller would have been the first Indigenous woman named to the federal bench, and she led Canada's national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from 2016 to 2019. And we invited her to give a talk on civil discourse at the University of Toronto Mississauga because, I don't know about you, but I can't think of someone who has had more difficult conversations in Canada over the last few years. And after Judge Buller gave excellent remarks,
she was asked by a student, how do you deal with someone who has, who completely rejects the possibility that there could be, let's say, human remains at a residential school like Kamloops? How do you deal with someone like that? Because we don't live, I don't think, we live actually in a post-fact situation. We live in a competing fact situation. You have your studies, I have mine. I have a peer-reviewed ground-penetrating analysis, blah, 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 and you've got yours. How do you deal with someone like that? And so Judge Buller replied, you don't say to them, why do you think that? Which immediately leads to conflict. You say to them, why do you want to think that? And then you listen to what they have to say. You're creating an invitation in. So rather than getting right away into a debate with someone, you are allowing them to tell you why something like this bothers them so much. I don't want to be part of a country where that might have been the case, or something along those lines. But then Judge Buller said, if the person just comes right back at you with the same thing they were saying before, they're not listening, and that's your limit, and you walk away. But you create an occasion, but if you can tell the other person isn't there for the same reason you are, then that, to my mind, is the limit on listening. Listen only to a certain degree, but if there's not openness, move on.
So as I mentioned in my talk, I did a lot of listening over the course of the last year and a half to our community members. And though I certainly wouldn't say that I was listening to the kinds of accounts that Randy has described, they were definitely weighty conversations, sometimes very weighty conversations. And it was a question that I asked myself on a number of occasions. What is the limit of listening? And when does it cease to be productive? And I don't know that I have the answer to that question, but I will say this. I see some of our faculty members from the psychology department in the audience right now, and I'm so happy you're here because I have wondered, given that a lot of this listening makes extraordinary emotional demands of people, psychological demands, right? These are not transactional conversations. They must never be. I've often wondered whether we need mix things up a little bit and maybe displace the sociologists and anthropologists a little bit and involve psychologists and psychotherapists and social workers in these kinds of conversations. I know that's already being done in other organizations. It's crucial. And I would say that the more I think about civil discourse and the more convinced I become of the centrality of emotion in civil discourse, the more I think that's a whole champ d'expertise, a whole area of expertise that really needs to be mined by and for us.
Hi. My question is for all the speakers. I'm just wondering, we are in a university setting. We are under colonial occupation ourselves. I am a settler of color. I'm part of, the colonial occupation of this place. Concordia is part of that too. And we often don't get to see those layers and power is there, be it in colonial privileges that I hold and many of you hold in here, be it in the privileges of attending university and stuff. I'm just really worried about how this discourse of civil discourse, ideally from what you presented, civil discourse is a way in which we listen to each other, in which we co-create knowledge, in which we are vulnerable, we open up. And even though we have very different ways of seeing the world and our experiences, and we bring trauma because the things that are happening in the world are very traumatic. And so, yes, I understand what you're saying about civil discourse. I'm just worried about how power dynamics will, trying to apply this into the real world, and then power dynamics are everywhere. It's just, the discourse of civil discourse can be instrumentalized to oppress people, further oppress people, and that's just a reality. What you were saying, I believe, Kim, about like power is held within each one of us, power to control our emotions. I think that's very true, that's very real. However, I feel like it ignores the power, the systemic power that there's out there. Students could feel empowered to go to Senate, student senators can feel empowered to go to Senate and try to pass a motion and talk to their communities and be like, this is what's bothering us, and we come to this agreement, and I feel empowered, I'm gonna pass this motion, and we're gonna talk about it in Senate. And then whoever is facilitating can be like, no, you don't get a chance to speak, and that could be shut down. So that's what this is an example of like how power, when it's very real, it has tangible like ways of acting on people. I understand that each one of us has power, but I think that the discourse of civil discourse that does not take into consideration how systemic, how power is embedded in every single layer of just Concordia, but in all of this like colonial society that we live in Montreal. And Canada, right? I think it can be instrumentalized, and that worries me. And my question is like, what can we do to be aware of this, to like expect it, to catch it when it shows up? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So one thing I think is that, I think Randy was bringing up that we're more aware of, was it Randy? That other people's who have power, and we're less aware when we have power. So I think that's an important part. And there's so many different kinds of power. And I think at the university campus, there's intellectual power, there's bureaucratic power, there's social power, and all these things are functioning. But one thing I think about is that the really big power, and Marc alluded to it in his talk, like we're all, I think, freaked out about a lot of things happening in the world. And the one, I think you're bringing up really great points about the things we have to consider. If we really want to have civil discourse, how do we bring everyone to it? And also when we don't have civil discourse on campuses, I really think about who's benefiting. There's people benefiting. There's a lot of people benefiting when our ability to communicate breaks down, and it's not good. So I think that your points are excellent, and these are things we have to be mindful so that we and just be aware, like these dynamics of being human, like they're operational, and so how do we mitigate them in order to pursue a dialogue, and again to ensure that these other more oppressive powers aren't sort of winning when our power games totally pull us apart.
Yeah, I'll build on Kim's point, and I'll say that you're right that we are all implicated in various kinds of power. People tell me I have a tough job. I actually have a really easy job. It's in my job title to do this kind of thing. Think about all the power encoded in having a job title and a tenured position at the University of Toronto and benefits that give me glasses like this. All of these things are articulations of a certain level of power and security. What you described with your example speaks to Michael Sandel's criticism about the civic consequences of economic power, the civic consequences of procedural power, of trying to bring forward a motion and doing it the wrong way, not knowing the right way to do it. One of the features I have seen in terms of frustration that students especially have with the way power is wielded at the university is a level of literacy. How does this actually work? Tell me how this actually works. There's this 80-page PDF written in 1971. Really? Is this how it really works? Or are there norms and practices, certain ways of doing things that at some level, it's a good thing. We don't want every single thing to be cited in a manual, but you have to be able to negotiate these things, and that can be difficult depending on where you're coming from. But to your final point about our living, or your main point, I think, about our living under these colonial conditions and being aware of it, being aware of our implication, well, you're right. That is the world as it is. All of us have phones in our pocket that probably have rare metals in them, and we probably don't want to know who got that metal under what conditions to allow us to play with our phones all the time. We are implicated in the world as it is. And the question then becomes, do you want to be on the inside of the institution affecting change or on the outside protesting it? And I say that neutrally and genuinely. I'm an institutional actor. I am drawn to being on the inside and trying to make things less bad. Notice my realism there. Not better, less bad when it comes to difficult conversations. And if you think you can be on the inside too, run for something, try this, try that. For some people, it's being on the outside and protesting. I think these are valid positions to take that make sense when you discern the best way to make use of your time and gifts in the place where you are. While again, and I'm just quoting V.S. Naipaul here, the great Trinidadian writer, you have to accept the world as it is and then do something about it.
Very complete answer.
Oh, thank you so much for this amazing panel. I absolutely sat here and I enjoyed, and I was also triggered and challenged by some of the ideas, and I love that. I love when I feel challenged because this is absolutely one of the core of my work, not recently, but in many, many, many years. And I do have 4 questions, but I will keep time for others. I don't want to take the space. So and please Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, if I was listening, but maybe I didn't get you right. So just feel free to correct me. So when you say narrative is something that might not be useful in civil discourse.
So narrative is going to be in civil discourse. There's no way around it. It's how our brains work, and it's very useful. So all I'm saying is that when we talk about how we want to approach it, that we set it on universals, and then the narratives are how we will communicate. So the narratives will be brought in by everyone engaging in the civil discourse, but it's just that to be careful that we don't set civil discourse upon a series of narratives.
So if I understand you correct, what you are saying, it's a stage in the process. That we first start with something that bring us together, and then we can bring the narratives, because narrative is identity, lived experiences, power relations, power dynamics, all these elements that absolutely will help us navigate or not navigate the conversation, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, what is the goal of the civic discourse? If I understand, if the goal is to build connection, then we might not really go deep into the narratives. But if it's repairing relationships, then this is where we go deep, if I understand. So I want to hear your point on that. And my other point is trust and power exists elsewhere. I love these both points. The one, I see trust as a symptom. And if we want to engage in a meaningful discourse and civil discourse, we want to dig beyond and beneath what created this mistrust, which is bringing the marginality, the oppression, and all these elements that we want to talk about them. So trust is absolutely a symptom. My question is how to dig deep. And the other one that I saw very clearly, that people think, even ministers, even presidents believe that the power exists elsewhere. This is crazy, and I saw that. So how we brought about agency, so people understand that they do have agency in this process. So this is, this is the question I also wanted to ask, and thank you.
So just on the first question, basically, I just don't think you're going to bring people together into a discourse or a dialogue without narrative. So there's no sense in trying to avoid it. But I think you're right. You do want to build connection and understanding. And as I said, it's the foundation of a lot of other things that we want to do, like taking action and things like that. But we can't skip the dialogue. So what I do think is when civil discourse gets off on the wrong foot, it's when we start off with narratives. And I think that we have work to do to get rid of those narratives. I think they're operational and active, in how we approach it at universities. And Randy's completely right that it's not something that you watch a YouTube video or a podcast and then you're an expert. It has to be practice. It's a practice. So yeah, so I think narratives will be there, and then we try to learn from each other. So, yeah.
And I think maybe I agree with what Kim just said. It's being self-aware that it's a narrative that you're bringing to this, that there's a certain version of the story that you have already, you know, that with certain antagonists and protagonists involved in it. I wanted to speak, though, to your question about what's the point of civil discourse. In a university context, it is to advance knowledge through teaching and research. And if civil discourse doesn't support that, it's useless. It's procedural. We shouldn't just all agree it's good to have a conversation. I should learn something because of it, or else why bother? I think that universities need to affirm fundamentally their mission is to advance knowledge through teaching and research, and everything flows to and from that mission, including civil discourse itself, whether it's in the classroom or beyond. And if we get that right, then we're sending people out into contemporary Montreal and elsewhere better able to be in a meeting with members of a team where they have to make a decision and they disagree with each other, and they say so, and they figure it out because no one has a complete view, and they trust each other that they can do this. You know, and I think just the last point I'll make, I was in a conversation with someone I didn't know at all after an event last week at U of T, and we were talking about a pretty complicated situation she was dealing with in a healthcare setting that was very political and divisive. And she was asking me my thoughts on it. I don't even know her name. And I started giving her my thoughts. And after a little while, I started to think, what could go wrong here? Because I'm speaking in a very unguarded way, just getting my coat on in a corridor. And then I thought, whatever, it's gonna be fine. And I just thought, I read the person, she seemed genuine, she was struggling to figure something out about politics as they played out in a healthcare team setting when people had different politics evident on their social media feeds. But again, for me, it's not trust, it's being able to read the other person. As an English professor, I teach close reading. It's not about reading a poem, it's about reading the world around you, reading other people. I could tell she was genuinely struggling with something. So I thought, yeah, I'll tell her what I actually think about this, as opposed to, these are difficult conversations, many thanks, there are many perspectives on this, click here for support. That's not gonna work.
Thanks. Okay, so what's the best thing or most generative thing about trust? We could answer that in all sorts of different ways, but I think one of the answers I want to offer is you can get it wrong, right? You can be fallible in the presence of the other when you trust them and when they trust you, when they trust that fundamentally you're not a person who is rotten to the core, right? Who is invested in oppression and all the rest of it, but who is genuinely trying to wrestle better, right? Which is something I mentioned. I think probably that our discussions about civil discourse need to bear that in mind, that we are going to trip over our narrative sometimes, right? We're sometimes going to present it in ways that are far less than curated, right? We're going to present it in ways that are awkward and messy and contradictory. All of that's going to happen. And I think one of the things that many are struggling with on campuses around the world is that the trust has eroded to such a point that they're terrified of getting it wrong. They're terrified of making mistakes. They're terrified of saying things that they then walk back later having learned. Right? And so I guess fallibility for me is not something I mentioned in here, but it's part of of considering the whole human in this project.
Can I give you an example of getting something wrong? Yeah, sure. Let me give an example of getting something wrong. I was chatting with a colleague who's a professor of Indigenous Studies at U of T about an effort at hiring more Indigenous faculty at the University of Toronto. And I was asking him how we understand the question of hiring Indigenous faculty. Is it Indigenous faculty who are from the nation state of Canada, Or is it Indigenous faculty, Indigenous scholars writ large and globally? Could it include people from New Zealand? Could it include Native Americans? And I kept on going. And he responded, and then he said, Randy, we wouldn't say Native Americans. And then we kept on having a conversation about hiring Indigenous faculty. A different version of that conversation is, hang on, what was that term you just used? What did that just reveal about you? But my colleague, and we're not particularly close, but we were both trying to figure something, we were thinking out loud together about how to encourage more Indigenous hiring. Should we think about it in nation state terms? Should we think about it globally? I got something wrong along the way, and the key is he kept going. He pointed it out to me. I was grateful he did, but we didn't stop there. And I think too often people stop right there. I got it wrong, but he thought what was more important was hiring more Indigenous faculty at U of T than correcting my use of a term. You see what I'm saying? So we kept on going. And that was a good example to my mind of getting something wrong, of being fallible, and trust working out in that case.
Hi, thank you all for a really stimulating conversation. So many thoughts going through my mind, and Marc, I thank you for the shout out to bringing in a psychology perspective. Thank you. And I've been thinking quite a bit about the effects of the pandemic, right? So there's this complete isolation and really people turning inwards and developing this shell pretty much where no longer feeling safe in the world on a large scale, but safe around people and having a hard time emerging from that. This is something I've seen psychologically, is really people struggling to find a way to reconnect with one another, even in one-on-one relationships, let alone large-scale group interactions. And pile on top of that technology that you already spoke about, which is really priming our brains to be used to immediate gratification. And if I can't get immediate gratification, I'm not interested. And these discussions that you're encouraging us to have require patience. And right, so it's contradictory in that sense. We're now programmed to want it now, and oh wait a minute, I need to slow down and think and let this sink through, and also have this tolerance for frustration, which you touched upon when you spoke about the technology, how we become frustrated, we just move on, right? So that's our habit. I'm frustrated, poof, do something else, not interested. So we have all these contradictory requirements of us hitting us all at the same time, which I think is in a way setting us up for, I don't want to say failure, but wanting to shy away from this sort of discomfort that you spoke about. So I just wanted to raise that as an issue. Is I think we're all struggling. Just look at interpersonal relationships, right? Forget the group conversations we need to have. Some of us are struggling having these conversations in one-on-one relationships where am I going to be canceled, right? That's the thing now. As you said, no more tolerance for imperfection and getting it wrong. And it's okay to get it wrong. So we're lacking in compassion, but also self-compassion.
Can I ask a version of that to Kim? The key word you just used was patience. We all lost our ability to have patience. And I will normally start talking about the importance of reading novels, blah, 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 blah. Not that of course, very important. But Kim, in your teaching, are students struggling to sit through movies? I hear this from colleagues elsewhere who work in cinema studies, that it's not that to watch a movie with no device in your hand, to sit there for 2 hours and just watch a movie unfold, that this is difficult for people, as opposed to it's difficult to read a novel for 2 hours. Do you notice that at all? which I think has a knock-on effect to some of the challenges you're describing.
I have to say, I can't speak to it because I teach like film theory, screenwriting, so I haven't had that experience of putting on a film. I do ban phones in the classroom. It was really interesting because I took a German language course as an adult, like in my early 40s, and I had this experience of being in a classroom and your phone talks to you, like your phone calls you like a siren song. And so I think it's really important to have phones down, but I have heard this. And I've heard that Netflix and other streamers are counseling their filmmakers to make sure they to do exposition, which is verboten. It's the worst thing you can do in a film, but to explain what's happening because people are looking at their phones. Yeah, they're not watching. They're dual screen. Apparently the millennials dual screened by looking on Wikipedia and looking up things that were related to what they're watching. And the Gen Z apparently are like actually just scrolling other things. So this is not good for our brains. Yeah, so it's alarming, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about, first of all, all the universities come up with their word of the year, and I definitely think Oxford won this year because their word of the year was rage bait, which, as everyone's realizing, that we used to think sex sells, and that was the thing that, everybody gravitated to, but actually rage beats sex by a long shot in terms of what really gets people going and generates attention, and that's what people tend to share online, and that's what goes around the world a million times. So when we used to have people getting hurt or triggered or alarmed in their social interactions systematically with other people, now that's all happening, but then we layer on the internet, and then that's happening as well. And then I think what you're speaking to is this anxiety and difficulty in engaging together. And I will just also give a shout out to Liz Miller, who's an amazing professor you have here in Concordia in the communication department. And we met up last night and she was talking about how important, like this bringing the students together in the classroom is one of the most important things we can do. And she has this beautiful thoughts about like making them want to come for the sake of it. I can't really explain it, give it justice, but I think that's what we should be thinking about as professors is, I always think of it in terms of they need to get their participation marks, but if you can think about how you can make them want to come and start to re-engage together, that's one of the most important things I think we can do as professors.
So I want to recount an anecdote of some of the most successful civil discourse I engaged in over the course of the past year that generated absolutely no results. So I met because I did listening sessions, of course, which were more about hearing lived experiences. But then, of course, I had many, many meetings with people who had lots of concerns about the way things are happening on campus right now. And so that it's the latter that I'm referring to here. And it was a community member who indeed had some fairly significant concerns about how things were unfolding at Concordia. And, this person and I, who were ostensibly on opposite sides, okay? We talked for 6 hours, 3 sessions of 2 hours each. And at certain points, we said to one another, what are we doing? Like, we are really busy people. What are we doing? And then we realized that that's what this is all about. At the end of it, let me tell you, this person was not convinced by me, and I was not convinced by them. But it was the process that mattered, right? It was the process that mattered. And I'll tell you why it mattered. I said it generated absolutely nothing. That's not true. You can imagine that over the course of 6 hours, we did manage to educate each other a little bit on a few things, and that really mattered. Educating one another a little bit, persuading one another a little bit in this day and age is a huge victory, a huge victory. But most of all, after those 3 meetings, we liked each other a lot more. And you know what? That was the key. Because after that, even though we found ourselves on opposite sides of just about every issue, we could call one another. And I could say, look, what's going on over there? I don't get it. You got to help me understand. And they would ask me the same questions. So there was something, again, uniquely human about that. And I realized that really it was the journey, not the destination. Had I measured those discussions by the deliverables, it would not have been a good result. But by assessing them via the process, it was a resounding success. And we were exhausted after and vowed never to talk again. No, I'm just kidding. But it really was, I look back on that series of exchanges with somebody I very much disagree with, and I think that was a good moment.
First, I have to thank you all for this afternoon and congratulate you, Marc. You are going to get a pizza from me. I make my own pizza. This has been a...
Delivered at Toronto or Windsor.
We can talk. This has been a breath of fresh air, and I really mean that quite literally, because the state of affairs we are in has been quite oppressive and hard to breathe. I almost feel guilty following what you just said, Marc, with the question I'm about to ask, but I have to. So I've been preoccupied for some time, 2.5 years, let's say, with the question of how to fix a broken university. And needless to say, this state of things has left me in a state of despair, largely because of many of the things that you talked about in your talk, Marc, the political statelessness, the fractured alliances, the pervasive rage, the distrust, and frankly, the trauma of incivility that I've both witnessed and lived. So I'm increasingly of the view that dialogue can only work with people who understand what it is and who genuinely want to do it. So this means that I've all but given up, I think I have given up actually, on the people who are dug in, who take a rigid binary position that some things are just, and I'm quoting here, undebatable, that there's only one valid way of making sense of the world and world events, and if you think differently, that you must be canceled. It's becoming nearly impossible to not want to cancel the cancelers. And so increasingly my focus has turned to trying to reach the reachable. And I guess my question is that a mistake? And if it is a mistake, how do I fix it?
So I think it was spoken of in the presentations about just how, again, how Randy said it needs to be built. It can't happen immediately. But I think by having these conversations and for you to share so eloquently the way you have is a step towards doing that. I think if you can focus on the people you can connect with and that you can reach, I would say do that, because I would worry about, canceling the cancelers, what that could drag you into. And you two might have a better sense of what might happen. But I would say hold on to, there's hope in what you're saying. So try to hold on to that and think about, maybe talk to Marc afterwards, like how do we grow from here in terms of understanding how we communicate across difference? And it's really, really important. And the whole, you were talking about people who are like, it's my way, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong and a terrible person. We really can't let that happen at universities, because it's there's an article that came out in 2024, and it's got the word Trumps in it, but it's by I think it's maybe psychology professors, Schwab et al., and it's about concordance over truth, and it's all about the more somebody believes their own side is objectively right, the more susceptible they are to forwarding fake news, believing fake news, forwarding fake news, not trusting true news stories that disagree with their priors. So those people can't even navigate the world properly. So it's really important for everyone to have that sort of epistemic humility, which is, I think, what is the basis of what's missing and what you're in the people that you're struggling to connect with.
maybe two observations in response. The first is that I've heard, as you can imagine, variations on the university is broken despair, the lament at Toronto. And at some level, it's not true. 90% of students and faculty and staff are just going along. I'm speaking of the University of Toronto, but let's see if there's some version of it at Concordia with their lives. They're studying, they're commuting, they're doing their research, they're in disciplines that aren't themselves politically attached to fraught questions. But for, let's say, and again, I'm speaking very broadly here, the 10% who are very invested in the institution as their source of affiliation, belonging, and identity, it does feel broken. And it feels broken very much by the question of Israel and Palestine, by the expectations of the institution's role, let's say, as a public actor. And then every now and then you're reminded that there are other fraught questions where even if someone's an absolutist on Israel-Palestine, on the question of Israel and Palestine, they can't be elsewhere. What I'm thinking about is the same event I mentioned last week at U of T. It was an event on difficult conversations and critical care. The panelists were a critical care pediatrician, a family advocate with a tragic family story, a bioethicist, and me. And it turned on having difficult conversations in the ICU about organ donation with children who are about to die. This is a completely different kind of difficult conversation than some of the debates sometimes that animate so much university upset. And what I learned from that was that that's normal life for people in healthcare. And they don't really call it a difficult conversation. That's just called the work they do. And it's figuring out how to do that work with each other. And I think to myself, if we can find ways for people who otherwise, as you say, maybe reject anything that doesn't completely reflect their worldview, to realize that there's so much going on at an amazing university where you see difficult conversation with real stakes and like, you have to make a decision about this in less than 2 minutes. I mean, my goodness, the ability to have a difficult conversation and deal with disagreement there is something that I would hope someone, however absolutist they are on another topic, could be open to and learn from. And then we can learn from others that way. And that's what it means to be part of, I think, a larger intentional community like a university. But at some other level, I go back to Judge Buller, there's only so much time in the day. There's only so much energy in the day. I would bake a pizza instead of trying to have a conversation with someone who wants to cancel you.
Well, those are two brilliant responses. I will just say briefly, and it's woefully pragmatic. I've been accused of worse, I suppose. But I would say managing expectations is a big part of this as well, right? Now, we have alluded repeatedly up here to the fact that civil discourse is not easy, it's messy, it's hard, it's often unsatisfying because things don't get resolved, we don't necessarily reach conclusions or perfect consensus. And in order to be able to tolerate that, you do need to manage your expectations, right? And sometimes just getting to a point where you can be in the same room as a person or persons who have hurt you, offended you, disgusted you, and you can be in that space with them in a reasonably harmonious manner and perhaps get other forms of work done together. That's something, right? That's something. But there is no magic bullet for, I don't think, for the question that you've asked. But that's one of the first things that comes to mind, and that is precisely why civil discourse is so hard, right? Because the yield is not always appreciable, exciting, and positive. Sometimes it's just, now I can sit in the same room as that person. Okay, that's step one, right? Yeah, please. Sorry. I'm good. Yeah.
apologies. I see the time creeping up on us. I think we have time for one last question. So Arwen, please go ahead.
Hi.
This is where everything goes off the rails. Please go ahead.
Totally. I'm going to bring in the staff perspective. I don't have a PhD. Thank you so much for this. You know, I've worked at a number of different universities in staff roles over the last 20 years, and especially in the last 2 years, I've been part of a lot of very difficult conversations on campus through my involvement in my former involvement in the Strive Task Force. I also currently work now in the Office of Student Life and Engagement, and I have to say it's my favorite team that I've been a part of so far, just because it's such a privilege to be involved in students' lives in a way that isn't involving a grade, where you're really helping them in different aspects of their life and their studies, while also, you know, hearing the politics they're navigating, the personal that they're navigating. And I'm just curious, this might be more of a Randy question, but I'm curious to hear from all of you if you have something to add. How you work with student life staff in your current work, and how you wish you could be working with them, and maybe student life more generally, and what you see as the role of staff in that process of civil discourse.
Excellent question and a lovely reflection. One of the sources of tension, of friction, when we created the Civil Discourse Working Group at the University of Toronto, was that the provost made the decision, which I supported, that no staff were on the working group. They staffed it, but they were not on the working group. It was professors and students, because he made the case, which I agreed with, that the main source of conflict was between professors and students, between professors and professors, and between students and students. This isn't to say that staff don't have a profound and crucial role to play, and they are involved now in our implementation work. But this created a tension straight away, and it created barriers and perceptions that we had to overcome. And I think where I saw the most productive version of this tension was collaborating with Student Life on an event that got postponed because of the snowstorm, actually, that involved the president in conversation with a group of students, about our new president, Melanie Wooden, in conversation with a group of students. And I'll be reductive, but simply put, my colleagues in Student Life were very invested in preparing the students for this high-stakes event, hundreds of people in one of our big shiny buildings at U of T, on stage with the president talking about civil discourse. I just wanted them to show up and start talking. I don't think either of us had it right, to be honest. And it was collaborating with staff and Student Life to realize that you want to provide that holistic support, but you also have to let them take a chance, get something wrong, actually be scared to be on stage with the president of the University of Toronto, having a conversation where you don't know what the questions are in advance. But it's meeting in between, and I think that's where the academic mission of the university exceeds the classroom. That's the kind of whole person opportunity we have, collaborating as faculty and staff in support of our students. So it's finding those moments, and it's realizing, as a faculty member, I had a too straightforward view. No, show up, it's gonna be great. And if it's not great, it's gonna be great anyway. And then maybe a too supportive model, to be quite honest. It's finding something in between that I think best serves students.
I would just say that I've enjoyed this conversation. I've really enjoyed the questions, and I want to thank everyone in the audience for their really thoughtful and productive questions. And, hopefully this will be the start of something. I mentioned talk to Marc, but I would love to see something happen across the country on this, because this is not an isolated, every university is dealing with this, I think, always in different ways, but there's no university immune. So I think this was a really great starting point, and maybe we can build on this across the country. And of course, staff are important, because I agree with Randy, they're not really instigators in this problem, but they're dealing with it. They have to deal with everybody who is rattled. So they have to be a part of the conversation too. So I think that's a really great question. And if we can tackle it with everybody involved on campus and across the country.
Thank you. It's been a really necessary conversation. I want to share by way of closing just 3 takeaways that I'm personally going to work on. I'm going to try to resist the urge to be humble about others. Thank you for bringing that forward. I think that's an area of development for myself. I'm only talking on behalf of myself. I also want to be aware of, and I appreciate the mention of the speed of frustration. And I think as part of that discussion, the extension of the speed of contempt. And I think actually maybe there's a little bit of a linear trajectory there. So that's something I'm going to be keeping in mind as well. And finally, I do think it's extremely important to recognize the everyday acts of civil discourse, even if that's the goal in and of itself. So I want to thank all our panelists today and for people in attendance for sharing these and many other reflections. I agree. These are the beginning stages of where to go next, not the end of the discussion. But we will close here today, for now. But we're closing with deep appreciation for everything that everyone has done to navigate these very, very choppy waters. And I think we'll close with saying until next time. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Fourth Space. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Fatima. Have a great afternoon, all.
Okay, thank you to everyone who came into Fourth Space today for this and for activating this conversation. Wanted to make a note to those of you on Zoom who asked your questions. Mo, we see your questions, we see your comments. We're going to make sure we get those to the organizers. Thank you again. To everyone, we're going to go ahead, close up the Zoom and the live stream now. But just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you wish to revisit or share it. Please join us again, I believe, for our next conversation with Strive. Look out for that in March. Thanks so much and have a wonderful evening.